Well, hey, this morning we're launching a new segment where we go on the record with experts to talk more about the things that are impacting your life. Today's topic is the economy, how it impacts you. This morning we're on the record with Dr. Klajdi Bregu, an economic professor at Indiana University South Bend, talking about inflation, the debt ceiling, and the possibility of a recession. Dr. Bregu, thank you for joining me this morning.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, let's begin here. I want to start with the possibility and fear of a U.S. recession. It's been talked a lot in the media. Goldman Sachs just raised the probability of a recession. So let's start with the basics. For people at home, what is a recession?
So the basic definition, that the rule of thumb that we use when I teach my classes, is that it's 2 quarters of negative GDP growth. That's a rule of thumb because every time we've had 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, we have had a recession. But that's not the whole definition. We have other things that we look at, such as unemployment, other activities like manufacturing activity, and other things that the National Bureau of Economic Research looks at in order to determine if it is a recession or not. So it's much broader than simply GDP decreasing.
So we wouldn't necessarily know if we were in a recession until potentially we're out of it.
Exactly. So normally we know that we are in a recession once we are there. We do not, most of the time we do not know ahead of time, obviously, because the data tends to come with a lag as well. So like the data for GDP growth for the first quarter that we are in, it's going to come in during April. All right, so it takes time. Although we do have measures. For example, there is an Atlanta Fed GDP now that makes estimates. Their current estimate for the current quarter that we are in is 3.2%. So we're definitely not in a recession right now. And it will be very unlikely that we go from 3.2% growth to negative growth in the next quarter.
If we do enter a recession, just tell me, what would that mean for the average Michiana consumer who's watching this show right now, and how do you think it would impact their life?
So it depends on what the recession is going to be affected the most. If the recessions tend to affect a lot the goods sector, the last recession we had, the COVID recession, was a little bit different. The one that we are expecting to come, it's very likely going to be the same. So we're going to have the good recession where, for example, we're going to see a decrease in the demand for RVs. And we know that in our area here, for example, we have quite an important industry in RVs, and we've already seen a slowdown there, as we have seen a general slowdown in manufacturing. So it depends on the types of the jobs that we'll lose. It depends on how deep the recession will be. But of course, that unfortunately will mean that some people will lose their jobs, will have lower incomes, and of course, it's going to be harder to deal with during that period of time. Our hope is that it's not going to be a deep recession, though.
The U.S. hit the debt limit back in January, and Congress can raise the debt ceiling. And so it doesn't have a whole bunch of time to do so, though. If Congress doesn't raise the debt ceiling, though, what will that mean for us here in Michiana?
So not raising the debt ceiling seems like not an option. So if we do not raise the debt ceiling, we'll be in big trouble, because then the government is going to have to pay much higher interest rates, since people will start dumping the U.S. treasuries, will pay higher interest rates, which will mean fewer funds going to other areas, such as our area as well, coming from the federal government, in all sorts of spending that they are doing. I do not see that as a possibility. I do not think we will not be able to pass the debt ceiling. The problem is, as we get closer to it, we may still see the consequences of not raising the debt ceiling, which will be still, if we push it too close, we'll have higher interest rates, and that will start to impact the economy, especially in the situation we are in now with the banking sector, with all of the issues we have faced in the last week or so.
Okay. All right. Now, last question here. We're seeing inflation ease right now. The price of eggs dropped more than 30% in the last month. The White House has announced steps that it plans to take to reduce inflation. But some economists say that our economy is right now in an unstable position. So when will we see inflation drop from the historic levels that we've seen?
So that's a very good question. It's something that is extremely hard for us to predict, because we haven't seen this since the 70s. The nature of inflation, of course, was somewhat different this time. It had the COVID impact, but of course we had the monetary stimulus and the fiscal stimulus that impacted it. And so what we are seeing now, we are seeing that inflation is still being sticky in the service sector. It's really hard to predict. Our hope is that it will go down, but it's unlikely that it will go down without a recession. And when I say it will go down to the 2% level that the Federal Reserve targets, because it will definitely go down. But the problem is to reach the 2% target. It seems that it would be hard without a recession. So it's kind of on the one side, it's bad to have a recession, and on the other side, it's bad to have the inflation. But unfortunately, it seems like without a recession, we may not get the 2% level that we expect.
From January to February, we saw a decline in inflation and spending. You know, there's questions of whether or not what that will mean for the Fed rate hike. What do you believe?
So for what the Federal Reserve has told us, from what the Chair Jerome Powell has told us, is before the recent banking issues that we are facing, is that very likely we would expecting a 50 basis point increase in interest rates, but now it seems like even a 25 basis point increase is being in question, because what's taking a little bit more consideration is the financial situation we are in, and what financial sector is going on in the financial sector because of the two banks that have already failed and possibility of other banks failing. So raising interest rates a lot seems to be harder now. So now the Fed is being in between a hard place and a rock, so to speak, where raising interest rates, it may cause further trouble in the financial markets, but on the other side, not raising them may keep inflation high, which means they will have to raise them higher later and cause even more trouble in our economy.
Well, very important conversation. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have. Dr. Bregu, thank you so much for joining me to talk on the record.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back with more news after the break.